Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Why was it important to create an organization like the United Nations out of the ashes of World War II? What are some of the major issues being dealt with by the United Nations that impact people in the United States and around the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to be taking a look at some international issues and how they're covered by the media and what role the United Nations plays in dealing with a lot of these issues. My guest today is an expert, especially in the media area. My guest today is Katrina Vanden Heuvel. Ms. Katrina Vanden Heuvel is the editor, publisher, and part owner of the magazine The Nation. Katrina Vanden Heuvel is a frequent commentator on numerous political television programs, is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and she is the author of several books. Katrina, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill, for having me on.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into some of the issues shortly. Let's talk about The Nation magazine. Tell me, when was it formed? Why was it formed? What's your main theme with The Nation?
So The Nation was founded in 1865, right after the Civil War, by abolitionists committed to end slavery. It's the oldest continuously published weekly in the United States, but it's fiercely young as well. Every great writer, thinker has written for The Nation, from Albert Einstein to Henry James to Langston Hughes and Ralph Nader, James Baldwin, Hannah Arendt. And we are committed, Bill, to alternatives to a mainstream corporate media. How do you make this country and the world more just, more secure, more peaceful? We're now read by 500,000 people each week on many platforms. So we've invested in the future. On our actual birthday, July 1865 or 2015, we relaunched a great website. And I think one thing we do now, in a way that very few publications in this country do, we have a regular UN correspondent. And we have for many decades. In fact, our editor in 1945 was present at the creation of the UN. But Barbara Crissett, our UN correspondent, has the cover story in The Nation just last week, thenation.com. And it's really about the challenges, what we're talking about today, the challenges the UN is facing, moving into this tumultuous world.
Exactly right. And Barbara Crissett has been on the program a couple of times, and our viewers can go to www.thenation.com and get much more information about her articles and many others. Let's talk about international issues and go back, well, really flash back to World War II, flash back to August 1945, the creation of the United Nations. And the main architect of that was Franklin Roosevelt, then President of the United States in the mid-40s, really. And how important was it to create an organization like the UN to bring all the countries of the world under one roof at that time?
It was vital, Bill. If you think about the world coming out of that barbaric war, the commitment to ending the scourge of war was at the forefront of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's thinking, as he laid it out so eloquently in January 1941 with the four freedoms, which in essence, freedom from fear, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religious worship, freedom from want. They informed and animated the impulse behind creating this coalition, this federation of United Nations. Now, it was imperfect, as all such institutions are, but there was a commitment to trying to find a way forward that would not permit a World War III, countries having seen the brutality of that war. So I think Roosevelt, and of course Eleanor Roosevelt, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, having witnessed the birth of the UN, something her husband wasn't present for because it was after his death in 1945. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights follows on the great, not just idealistic, but very realistic impulses behind the United Nations. And Eleanor Roosevelt was a supreme politician. My father, who was deputy ambassador to UN under Jimmy Carter, but he remembered seeing her. And years later in New York City politics, but she brought those skills she had at the late 50s, early 60s to ensuring that obstacles would not permit the obliteration of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She worked tirelessly. Eleanor Roosevelt, 16 hours a day. And it is a document, you know, Bill, that has informed everyone from Lech Walesa to Mandela to legislatures around the country to constitutions around the world. It is a global document.
Exactly. And it's, of course, it borrowed heavily from the U.S. Bill of Rights, the
Yes.
Constitution.
The Magna Carta.
The French Rights of Man
Yes.
at that time. And of course, it was a very, very far-reaching document. And it was signed, I think, December 10th, 1948. So
And it's enduring. I mean, you pick it
That's
up
right.
today, and it could be written today. And it is a benchmark, it seems to me, for the racial justice, for the fighters against inequality, for climate justice, for the movements of our time, as well as governments.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned climate justice.
Yeah.
A lot of foreign policy analysts, scientists, people across the board think that climate change is without a doubt the number one problem we're confronting just in this country, but around the world. You see that the glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, desertification is taking place. There was a report the other day that showed in the Arctic ice mass is disappearing 1 foot per day. 1 foot per day. Just do the math on it, and we can see that the oceans are going to be rising even more. The UN is involved in a wide range of issues. One is in the climate change area, and there was a major conference in Paris this past December. What was the significance of that conference? I believe 196 groups, countries, states signed on to that. Why was that important?
I think it was vital because it also shows why the UN is vital, because issues today are no longer simply national. Climate change is the perfect example. You need a global community to combat this existential crisis of our time. What resulted from the global summit, I think, was the work of the United Nations and the governments who participated. But Bill, I also think it was the work of this new mass climate justice movement, which has pushed the UN and pushed governments to understand why climate is the existential crisis. I think it was not perfect, again, what came out, but the UN and its work is going to be vital moving forward because Secretary General, member countries are going to have to work together to ensure that the climate action plan is enacted, that countries are held accountable, and that there are measurements. What's criminal, I say sadly, as a citizen of this country, is that I think more could have been achieved on the US's part, but we have a Republican Party which is in denial about man's contribution to global emissions, and I think that will impact our country's future until we see a turning point. Fortunately, majorities understand that this is a real threat. I do think in some ways the Global Climate Summit signaled the end of the fossil fuel era, and I think it is the best plan we have to save the one planet we have.
Exactly, and apparently about 97% of the scientists have come together and agree upon the fact that climate change is taking place. We're leaving a carbon footprint. A large part of the problem is because of the fossil fuels.
Absolutely.
Coal, oil, gas, those types of things. And there is a movement because we see today I think they're becoming more cognizant of this, but also the alternative forms of energy, solar and wind, are becoming
much more accessible.
Exactly.
And I think that there is a real commitment and understanding that you can move to 100% renewable with a jobs plan, which I feel very seriously about. I mean, I know you're from Kentucky, and I think there's something called just transition, which is the idea that you have to help communities and displaced workers who will be displaced by the new technologies, but that you can do that. And we need to for the sake of the planet. But we also have to be, I think, sensitive to the extraordinary displacement and positive change. It's like a new industrial revolution without the coal, without the soot, without the dirt. But renewable energies are very exciting and available.
And there will be jobs in the renewable area.
Right.
You will have solar plants.
That's right.
You will have people working,
but it's a
putting up
leap.
windmills.
It's a leap. And
That's
you
true.
know, and I think part of that leap is about understanding a new world. I think the UN is part of that world, but it too needs to, it's like a transition. It's been part of an old world and it's evolving. Where do we head? And we're all kind of, I think in a moment, it almost leads to vertigo. You know, really, I feel that. It's like the old order is disappearing, but the new one
Rapidly
is not yet
fading.
born. I see
That's
that in the
right.
media. I think we see it in every
Bob
area
Dylan.
of our life.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Very true, yeah. Now, the international issues, today I will contend that all international issues have local impacts,
Right,
obviously. We
right.
talk about climate change, we talk about health problems, we talk about whatever, helping to move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information around the world. These all have international implications. How important is it for our media? And a lot of us, we who are in the media, feel that especially the U.S. media, perhaps the international media do a better job, but a lot of the U.S. media do not cover international issues, and they don't cover the United Nations very well. I mean, there are some good people covering the UN, I'm not saying that,
Right.
but generally speaking, a large number of newspapers, media outlets in the United States don't focus on the UN and the issues, which every international issue is
Comes
being
to the
debated
UN.
here. It's being debated here.
I interviewed Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson in 2013, and he said, you know, the UN is essentially the world's geopolitical emergency room. At the same time, he didn't want to be critical of the media. He's a great diplomat. But as he said, too much of our media, particularly in this country, Bill, is focused on conflict. It seeks conflict. It covers conflict. The coverage of diplomacy, of negotiation, is often downgraded or treated as a secondary tier. The bellicosity in so much of our media discussions does not lend itself to an understanding of an institution which was founded to find an alternative to war, to find and lift up diplomacy to resolve our world's problems. I think that we do need to bring the UN's work to bear to show Americans how it impacts their lives. Too much of the focus in the media has also been, maybe rightly so again, conflict on the gridlock in the Security Council. What we don't hear about are some of the extraordinary agencies, for example, global poverty, or the refugee crisis, which the UN is dealing with. That's coming to this country. I mean, the discussion about borrowing refugees or allowing refugees, climate change, as you said. So I think the ability to bring to bear the UN's work and to try and understand what the world would be like without the UN. It would be interesting to do a counterfactual, because as Jan Eliasson said, the media doesn't run headlines like, look what was prevented, right? It looks, you know, it looks at the ravages. Admittedly, the UN, of course, has its flaws. Much of that has to do with lack of funding. And the lack of funding, I think, is a chicken and egg. If the media paid more attention and lifted up what the UN did, and you had legislators around this country and in Washington respectful of it, understanding its benefits in a self-interested way too, I think we'd be better off.
And that's very true. A lot of people will argue that the United Nations helped prevent World War III.
Yes.
I know it's
Yes.
hard to prove that, but just think back to the missile crisis, 1962 in October. We were at the last button. The red button was going to be
Absolutely.
pushed. If that had been pushed, we wouldn't be here today, you and I, or any of the people in this studio. But by the same token, the UN played a critical role when Ambassador Adlai Stevenson came to the
Yes.
UN. The diplomats behind the scenes worked. Secretary General, then Secretary General U Thant was very instrumental in promoting shuttle diplomacy
Yes.
at that time, promoting a plan. But that could have been basically the end of the world as
The
we know
world,
it.
but even today, what would the world look like as we are consumed by concerns about war and terrorism without 16 peacekeeping operations which are underway around this world? Think of the Iran nuclear deal. It was vital to have diplomacy involved. Think of, in 2013, I believe, the deal to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons between Russia and the United States also prevented us from missile strikes. And I do think that Syria, in terms of the UN's challenges in this next period, resolving the Syrian conflict, which it has tried to do. I'm a great admirer of someone like Lakhdar Brahimi, who's been a UN stalwart for decades. But now is the time to double down, because if the Syrian conflict cannot be resolved diplomatically, there is no military resolution.
Exactly. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view some of our previous shows. Also, if you're involved in any type of media outlet, for example, a website, PBS, community access television, whatever it might be, and have an interest in sharing our shows with the public, please download them. Just go to the broadcasters page. Global Connections Television is provided as a free public service. There is no charge. Today we're taking a look at several international issues and the role of the media in covering these issues. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Katrina Vanden Heuvel. Katrina Vanden Heuvel is the editor, publisher, and part owner of The Nation magazine. Katrina, we've got quite a few
I'm
issues
not sure
to
there are
cover.
any experts on the media.
Well,
the way I mean, there are people who follow the media, assess
We
the
try
media.
to be.
Yeah.
That's right. You mentioned several things. I'm not going to go back through all of them, but one in particular, you mentioned about the Syrian refugees.
Yes,
And
yeah.
about 2 years ago, the Security Council was deadlocked. The Russians and Chinese at times were not in agreement with the Security Council resolution. But you were right. at that time, the focus was on the Security Council, but on the ground in Syria, you had several United Nations agencies,
Absolutely.
the World Food Program, the High Commission for Refugees,
Yes.
you had the UN Children's Fund, right in the line of fire, helping people stay alive and to move them away from a war zone.
Yes.
So there are many sides of the United Nations, and so often the Security Council gets the bulk of the coverage, whereas you've got a lot going on
There's
in many areas.
I believe, I think there's 30 programs, and maybe
Yeah,
some 30.
more, yes.
And as I said, there's the ILO too, the International Labor Organization.
Right.
And I think we should probably do this at the nation. If we did something every month, looking at these agencies, the UN Development Program, what they're actually doing, it would help give solidity and concreteness and a human face to an institution like any institution that can seem too large, too bureaucratic, and too impenetrable.
Exactly. Well, you were talking too about conflict, and the UN has been involved in trying to reduce conflict
Yeah.
with the 16 peacekeeping missions through negotiations on a variety of different levels. You got the Department of Political Affairs within the United Nations. Won't mention all of them, but let's think back to one major conflict that took place in March 2003, and that was the invasion of Iraq. And the media at that time, we think back to that, there was all these bogus
Yes.
pieces of misinformation, disinformation put out about how Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which most people around the world didn't believe it. The majority of the UN member states did not believe it. And they were right in
They were
not
right.
believing it.
I think the nation was resolutely opposed to the invasion of Iraq. It wasn't even whether we knew Saddam Hussein, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It was the belief that containment, an alternative to military action, which could in fact unleash the weapons of mass destruction. In any case, we now see more than a decade later what a debacle it was, what it has unleashed in this region. I think one of the most shameful moments of the U.S. government, and I wrote a piece I remain proud of for USA Today, which asked me to do a kind of dissident column that evening, was when Colin Powell came to the UN and used his magisterial authority to persuade the Security Council to vote for authorization. At what we know now is he had doctored bad intelligence from Iraqi dissidents, but it was a shameful moment because the UN should not be a pulpit for taking us to war. It should be trying to find alternatives to war.
Exactly. And as we think back to that too, the so-called
Yes.
mainstream media, even the New York Times participated in this rush to
Yes.
war. And as I recall, Judith Miller, who was one of
Judith Miller.
their major columnists, and she was receiving most of her information from Dick Cheney's assistant,
His
Scooter
sort of
Libby.
war room.
Exactly, the war room was giving them this misinformation. She would put it in the New York Times. It seems as though there's an effort today. I watch a wide range of programs, and I see Judith and other people coming out today, Paul Wolfowitz,
Yeah.
and they're almost trying to whitewash what happened in 2003. They're trying to rewrite history and
You're right. That
make
goes
it appear that there really was a threat, and there was no threat.
But Bill, it's even worse than that. I think their first agenda is to whitewash history and obviously redeem their reputations. But I sit across from Bill Kristol many Sundays on George Stephanopoulos' ABC This Week. And I
Who
turned
was
to
one
him,
of the neo-conservatives.
Bill
who's in
Kristol,
support
Weekly
of it.
Standard editor. I was on a program with him a few months ago where he was opposed to the Iran nuclear deal, essentially calling for bombing Iran. I turned to him and I said, Mr. Kristol, have you learned anything? Is there any accountability in our media system? You want us to take us back into a military action, possibly a war that could do nothing except cause more problems and chaos in a region which is already adrift in blood and chaos. In any case, I think they're all coming back out. I think there's great complicity on the part of our media that their voices are heard. I'm not calling for censorship, but they're not met by too many others. Our media still isn't bringing on dissident, alternative. There are too many military voices. Sometimes, though, the military voices are a little more realistic than the kind of ideological pundits. But I think, again, it speaks, Bill, to the failure to value diplomacy, negotiation, and the rush to think of war as the first resort, which has been so much of our political landscape. We need to change that mindset, and the UN is an important part of that.
Exactly. And if you, going back to the experts,
Yeah,
I might
yeah.
mention, when you see an expert on MSNBC, Fox, wherever it might be, Google that expert.
Right.
And in many cases, you will find that person is on the board of directors,
Yes.
receiving money from a defense contractor,
So
and
true.
has a vested interest in going to war. And as President Eisenhower warned back in 59 or 60, said that we have to be aware of the military-industrial complex. Today, we should say the military-industrial media congressional complex.
Contractor,
because they
too.
are all together.
What happened
in
after
this,
9/11
in moving this
is
country
the
forward
private
and the world.
Yeah, what happened after 9/11 though, the private contractor industry is just metastasized. So I think we can add many words, descriptions, but absolutely, I totally agree. And I think we at The Nation over the years, we had a great money and politics reporter who would do that Googling. And just to bring it to attention is called transparency, is called reporting we need, so people know the agenda.
Well, these are very serious issues, and we could
Yeah.
go for an hour or two. But let me ask you before we do run out of time. Your dad, you grew up tangentially involved in the United Nations.
Right.
Your dad was a deputy permanent representative with Ambassador Don McHenry, in the Carter administration. I guess he was here for about 2 or 3 years. Do you? I'm sure that was during the heady days of the Cold War. Do you have 1 or 2 stories about that briefly that you can share?
I mean, I think we're back in a new Cold War, but that's a different topic. I know
Right.
my father spent a lot of time, by the way, on the Iranian hostage crisis, which was, erupted in '79. But in April 1980, he was sitting in the Security Council, and he was the ambassador because Donald McHenry was traveling, so he was there. And 2 Maoists or Trotskyites got into the Security Council and threw red paint at the Soviet ambassador, Oleg Troyanovsky, and then at my father, the U.S. representative, because they wanted to expose U.S.-Soviet imperialism. So my father looked at Troyanovsky, who was livid, and then he thought for a moment. But they walked out, and a reporter asked them, "So what do you make?" And my father said, "Better red than dead." And it was the front page of the New York Post. And he has that suit to this day, because it was very scary, splattered with red paint. But it was a funny moment, and
that was the slogan back in the 70s and 80s.
Well,
exactly.
in the 50s,
in the 50s
40s,
really,
yeah.
sure,
So
that's
talking
right.
heyday of the Cold War, but it was a serious time, and he valued his time at the UN and remains a great citizen of the UN and a great supporter.
Exactly. Now, as you've watched the United Nations over the years, and the UN has changed quite dramatically. It's 70 years old this year. And what do you see as you look at the United Nations? What can it do to be more effective and more efficient in the future? Any organization can improve, and especially if you have an organization with 193 countries that are members of the board of directors.
My sense, and again, I'm not a student of this, you're closer to it than I am, and Barbara Chris said in her Nation article, the need, I think, to update how the UN approaches technology, social media. You need a message. You can't just do it with nothing. But I do think a real hard look at how the UN and its different agencies communicate with people is vital, because social media has some great tools. I think the UN needs to be clearer about its work around the world with the different missions, different programs, and make clear that the Security Council isn't its only brand, so to speak. And try and, I think, revive model United Nations in different communities so that kids learn about the value of the UN. Make it exciting. You can even do it via social media, and bring it into cities and towns across this country, so you at least have maybe a roving group of speakers who can communicate why the UN matters, even if you need to do it in the context of why it saves your community money, right? I mean, but there's so many ways the UN matters. But if you don't bring it closer to people, home to people, through media, through actual retail politics, I think it's complicated. I also think the UN would be wise to use, this is my father's idea, use its 75th anniversary in 2020, not simply as a celebratory moment, but to commit to ending the scourge of war, a concept which is in the charter, founding charter of the United Nations, and bring that message through public-private partnerships, through media, through new tools of social media, to people, and to try and explain why that is in the best interests, why it's the most productive and the most realistic.
Exactly. In our last 30 seconds, the hardest question, what do you think will be the major, we talked about climate change, but do you see another major international issue we'll be dealing with as we move forward?
Inequality.
Inequality.
Inequality, Bill, cuts across everything. It cuts across climate change. If you look at developed countries, if you look at the access to political power, you know, how working people are relating to political systems they no longer trust. Some of that is a feel that a rigged economy is shafting. I mean, they're just across so many boundaries, and I think the UN there too could play a role.
Exactly. And of course, as you mentioned, there's so many other parts of the United Nations we don't hear about, and we should realize that the UN has agencies that helps move aircraft safely in international airspace, ships safely on the high seas, helps move mail, weather information around the world. These are vital services that we all need. We depend upon them. We all fly, or most of us fly internationally. We've taken cruises, and the UN is not a perfect organization. It has imperfections, but it's still the only game in town that brings all 193 members of the member states together. But Katrina Vanden Heuvel with The Nation, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you
for
very
a very
much.
interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.